Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 11 hidden gems for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about players at a variety of different positions: running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, and kicker going into Week 11 that you would consider to be sleeper options, but I like to call them my hidden gems based on everyone's favorite cinematic universe. So over the course of today's episode, I'll talk about these players on an individual basis in order to justify as to why you might want to start them. Now, going into Week 11, of course, we have 4 teams snapped away and on a bye week, but not only that, we have a bunch of players out with injury. So in order to go ahead and make sure that we can find ourselves victorious in Week 11, we'll talk about these players that I consider to be my hidden gems and get you one step closer to capturing a victory in Week 11 and, of course, getting to the fantasy playoffs. Now, before we get into today's episode, again, if you're looking for my thoughts on one of these specific players, you can travel down to the description of the video. We have timestamps available there. While you're down there, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Besides the daily content, we also live stream on a daily basis. Later tonight, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll be here answering questions. If you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. I'm more than happy to help in regards to Week 11 lineups and or beyond that. Outside of that, again, at the end of today's episode, I will be putting together a couple entries via Underdog. Again, at this current moment in time, if you travel down to the description and check out the link, if you sign up using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to potentially follow the upcoming entries that we're going to make in regards to Week 11, but you'll go ahead and be able to claim the first time deposit offer and get my ranking sent to you from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, all encompassing rankings, including the flex, to help you set your lineups every single Sunday. So for those of you interested, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. And if in fact you are not eligible due to your current location, or if you've used my code or somebody else's code in the past, you can always find rankings and unlimited questions answered via the Patreon link also down in the description. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's go ahead and begin with the first hidden gem of the week. We begin with the Soul Stone of Dawson Knox, tight end of the Buffalo Bills. Now, as we all know, the Soul Stone unfortunately requires a sacrifice of a player that we love. And over the course of this season, we've thought really highly of Dalton Kincaid. And even though he hasn't had himself an abundance of overall consistency over the year, the fact of the matter is, going into Week 11, the Buffalo Bills taking on the Kansas City Chiefs will be without Dalton Kincaid. He has already been deemed out. So if we're going to be in a position in which Dawson Knox is going to be exposed to the entire tight end opportunity share of what the Buffalo Bills have to offer, over the course of this season thus far, from weeks 1 through 10, the tight end position has been averaging 7.6 targets, 4.5 receptions, 50 receiving yards, 0.4 receiving touchdowns, and 11.9 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format, which again, over the course of this upcoming week, with so many tight ends out due to the bye week, some due to injury, again, Dawson Knox could be a fantastic fill-in. Now, when we look at the past overall success of Dawson Knox prior to the arrival of Dalton Kincaid in 2023, when we look at the 2021 and 2022 seasons, including the postseason, in which Dawson Knox was the clear and away #1 tight end of this offense and got himself a lot of opportunity, in the games in which he was given 5 or more targets, he was averaging 10.97 fantasy points per game. He was able to get himself 17 games of 5 or more targets throughout those 2 seasons. Now, the primary reason Dawson Knox was able to find that level of success in only 17 games of 5+ targets was because in those 17 games, he had scored 10 receiving touchdowns. Down in the red zone, of course, he was one of the primary options for Josh Allen. Outside of Josh Allen's rushing utilization, which again, thus far this season has not been as prevalent, it has typically been the tight end position, which going into this week, in the absence of Dalton Kincaid, presents even more opportunity for Dawson Knox to be fantasy relevant. Now, you take on the Kansas City Chiefs, which this team had a privilege of taking on last season. In the 2 games in which the Buffalo Bills took on the Kansas City Chiefs, once in the regular season and once in the NFL playoffs, in one game, 11 targets, 8 catches, 57 yards. In the other, 6 targets, 6 catches, and 49 yards. That being the entire accumulation of Dawson Knox and Dalton Kincaid's overall efforts. Now, when we approach this upcoming week, the Kansas City Chiefs, over the course of this entire season, they've struggled against opposing tight ends. From weeks 5 through 10, thus far this season, in the last 5 games that the Kansas City Chiefs have taken on opposing tight ends, most recently they've allowed 3 catches for 55 to Denver tight ends, which again, Denver doesn't really have a viable tight end option. But against Tampa Bay, 9 catches, 78, 2 touchdowns. Las Vegas, 6 for 65. San Francisco, 6 for 92. And New Orleans, 7 for 44 and a touchdown. Over the course of the last 5 games, the Kansas City Chiefs are allowing 13.38 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends in a half PPR scoring format, which again, with the opportunity share that the Bills exposed to their tight ends, with the upcoming matchup taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, I would anticipate Dawson Knox to immediately find success, especially considering we have Keon Coleman already designated out as well. So there's less target competition going within the given week, on top of the fact that Amari Cooper is still questionable with his wrist injury and could, in fact, very similar to last week, be inactivated. If, in fact, that's going to be the case, Dawson Knox would have himself even more upside. He's currently only being rostered in 9% of leagues going into Week 11. I would say if, in fact, you're in need of a potential pickup and start going into this week, Dawson Knox is the answer as this week's Soul Stone. All right, let's move on to the next hidden gem for the week. We have Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who, again, is this week's reality stone, because the reality of the situation is Tank Bigsby, the primary running back over the course of the last month of the season for the Jacksonville Jaguars, has already been deemed out due to the ankle injury he sustained back in Week 10. Now, in his absence in Week 10, Travis Etienne, of course, was still coming off of his hamstring injury, but in the absence of Tank Bigsby, was given opportunity. 11 rushing attempts for 44 rushing yards, 1 target, 1 reception, only 4.8 fantasy points. But if it wasn't for the fact that Mac Jones scored a 1-yard rushing touchdown on the goal line with a QB sneak, we would have seen Travis Etienne surpass 10 fantasy points within the overall contest, taking on the Minnesota Vikings defense, which, again, within that overall matchup, the Jacksonville Jaguars were winning up until 1 minute and 42 seconds left in the third quarter. They had themselves a primary lead as a defense playing incredibly well. So going into this week, even though they do take on the Detroit Lions, don't expect this team to completely roll over. Yes, the Detroit Lions are probably a 10 to 14 point favorite based on Vegas going into this week, but I still do expect for Travis Etienne and this offense to put up a fight and continue to have to score for the entirety of this game in a negative game script. Now, as of thus far this season, in healthy games in which Travis Etienne has played, he's gotten himself 11 rushing attempts minimum every single game. He's averaging 4.44 yards per carry on average, which is significantly better than what he was producing last season, which was less than 4 yards per carry. And thus far this season, averaging 3.2 targets per game. With Mac Jones under center, already designated with Trevor Lawrence out this week, the expectation is that there could be even more exposure to opportunity within the receiving game. Understand that Mac Jones, back when he was the starting quarterback of the New England Patriots in 2023, he was targeting his running back 7.3 times per game, which led to 5.1 receptions to 34 receiving yards per game. If Travis Etienne is going to be exposed to the entire opportunity share of getting himself 5+ targets within the upcoming performance, expect his overall baseline of fantasy upside to be pretty strong, especially considering the absence of Tank Bigsby, which means he's getting all the rushing workload, getting himself all of the rushing goal line opportunities and third down opportunities, which is really going to be the entire offense going forward. Especially once this Detroit Lions offense takes a lead, it's going to force Mac Jones and this offense to have to throw for majority of that second half. Now, when we look at what Travis Etienne has done back in 2023, there's really been a narrative in regards to what the Jacksonville Jaguars offense is able to accomplish and what his fantasy point, per game averages look like when they win versus when they lose. And I've talked about this in the past, specifically this most recent offseason, in regards to the win versus loss splits. Last season, in games in which the Jacksonville Jaguars won, Travis Etienne was averaging 22 touches per game and 19.16 half PPR fantasy points per game. In games in 2023 in which they lost, only averaging 16 targets per game and 10 fantasy points per game, which again, mainly has to do with his rushing touchdowns and rushing upside of opportunity. The overall receiving workload, which was 4 targets per game, 3 receptions per game, and 28 receiving yards per game, was consistent across the board over the course of the entire season, regardless of win or loss. So hopefully he's going to be given 4 to 5, maybe 6 targets of opportunity, get himself 3 to 5 receptions, and in that circumstance, going to be significantly more valuable in comparison to where he has been in weeks past. Now, especially when you take on the Detroit Lions, it is difficult because you might not be able to run the ball as much, but as of late, the Detroit Lions have been giving up an average of 22 rushing attempts per game, 104 rushing yards, 0.75 rushing touchdowns per game, 4.75 targets, 3.5 receptions, 33 receiving yards. So again, as a total, on average, since week 7, the Detroit Lions are allowing 137 total yards to opposing running backs on a per game average, which is nearly 20 fantasy points per game when you take all of this into account in a half PPR. There is a lot of potential for upside in the case of Travis Etienne. Only started in 40% of leagues. I'm firing him up in the absence of Tank Bigsby. Moving on to this week's Power Stone, we have AUDRIC ESTIME, running back of the Denver Broncos. The first Denver Bronco we're going to talk about this week, because we're really all in on the idea that the Denver Broncos can not only compete within this upcoming matchup against the Atlanta Falcons, but potentially even win. Now, as it currently stands, AUDRIC ESTIME is only being started in 21% of leagues going into week 11. Now, with all the bye weeks and injuries that have taken place, many of us are going to be in need of a running back to potentially fill in within an RB2 spot or potentially within a flex position, especially for those of you who were relying upon Javonte Williams in the past. His role within the offense, specifically within the running game, has evaporated entirely. Now, he'll still get himself receiving utilization, but going forward, like Sean Payton and even the offensive coordinator Joe Lombardi has said thus far this week within press conferences, that AUDRIC ESTIME has looked great and they want to get him more opportunities on the ground to continue to succeed. And that's not really a surprise, especially considering what we have seen out of AUDRIC ESTIME thus far this season. Amongst all running backs thus far this season, with a minimum of 20 rushing attempts, he is number 9 amongst all running backs in terms of yards per carry on average, with a 5.1 yard per carry average. And he's number 7 amongst all running backs with a 3.72 yard after contact per attempt average. Again, he's continuing to be incredibly efficient, and even though this most recent week in which he played 45% of the snaps, handled 82% of the running back rushing attempts within the offense, even though it only led to 14 attempts and 53 rushing yards, understand that he was taking on the most difficult matchup at the running back position in terms of rushing statistics allowed. Thus far this season, the Kansas City Chiefs have been elite within that category. Nobody has found success against them. Therefore, if we're going to hold that against AUDRIC ESTIME, I think we're making a mistake. Going into this week, taking on the Atlanta Falcons, who are allowing 4.35 yards per carry on average, which again, in comparison to the Chiefs are only allowing 3.28 yards per carry on average, a whole yard difference. So if we're going to be in a situation in which we're using that Chiefs game and using it as ammunition as to why we shouldn't play AUDRIC ESTIME, again, we have to look past the overall matchup, because going into this week, he should find himself a lot more success, especially considering over the course of the last 5 games, the Atlanta Falcons have allowed the following yardage counts to opposing running backs: 93, 93, 76, 88, and most recently 65, of course, with a little bit of efforts from Taysom Hill that I did not include within the overall count. But again, from the running back position, still a lot of success on the ground. If we're going to be expecting a situation in which, of course, the Denver Broncos are going to consistently score, especially when we take into consideration how well quarterbacks have played against the Atlanta Falcons over the course of the last 2 months, if Bo Nix is able to move this offense down the field, expect the running game to be correlated with a lot of potential opportunities. And if we can get a goal line attempt and potentially have AUDRIC ESTIME falling into the end zone, double-digit fantasy points at base minimum should be expected. Again, even without receiving utilization and or target opportunity, I still expect him, as this week's Power Stone, a power back of sorts, to be himself a relevant option. All right, let's move on to the next hidden gem. We have the Space Stone, Quentin Johnston. Like every single week, the Power Stone's a running back. And every single week, the Space Stone is a wide receiver that is going to shoot for the moon. And in this specific scenario, we have Quentin Johnston, who, as of 2023, could not catch a ball to save his life. But thus far this season hasn't had a single drop over the course of the entire year. He has significantly improved over the course of this season and continues to play incredibly well. Now, even though he hasn't been given very many opportunities, in the healthy games that he has played this season, excluding week 6, in which he of course left early with an injury, he's only been given 25 total targets, which again, not a lot of opportunity, but thus far this season averaging 2.7 fantasy points per target, which is mainly because he has scored a receiving touchdown, 1 minimum, in 4 of the last 6 games he has played. Now, this week they take on the Cincinnati Bengals. In terms of their matchup, they're the 13th best at the wide receiver position, allowing 26.48 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. The following statistics have been allowed to opposing wide receivers: Bateman, most recently 6 catches, 54 and a touchdown. Jacoby Myers the week prior, 8 for 105. Devontae Smith, AJ Brown, both going over 84 yards, and Devontae Smith, on top of it, scoring a touchdown in that game. Cedric Tillman, 8 for 81. Bateman again earlier this season, 4 for 58 and a touchdown. Zay Flowers, 7 for 111. We have seen wide receivers on a consistent basis dominate against the secondary because they have not played well in terms of being able to stop opposing wide receivers. Therefore, I would assume that Quentin Johnston, going into this upcoming matchup, has himself an upside potential that could end up leading to a touchdown and double-digit fantasy points, which is why we're mentioning him here. Even though he is currently only being started in 16% of leagues going into week 11, you have to understand that Joe Burrow, on the opposite side of the ball, has thrown 9 passing touchdowns in the last 2 games. Now has T. Higgins returning for the upcoming shootout. Now, prior to recording this video, I went ahead and checked out the Vegas overall spread for this game and the total. Based on Vegas's overall projection, this is implied to be the second highest scoring game of the week, only behind Baltimore versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Therefore, if this is going to be an expected shootout with a 48.5 point total, I'm anticipating that Quentin Johnston will certainly be relevant, especially when we consider the fact that the Los Angeles Chargers offense has been throwing the ball significantly more over the course of the last month of the season. Quentin Johnston should be expected to see himself a lot more target opportunity within the upcoming performance. All right, moving on to this week's time stone, we have Bo Nix. Now, I mentioned it earlier in regards to AUDRIC ESTIME. Yes, we have 2 Broncos mentioned on today's episode. I'm all in on the idea of the Broncos offense finding success this week, especially considering whenever your quarterback is taking on the Atlanta Falcons, it's time to put them in the starting lineup. That is why Bo Nix is this week's time stone. Over the course of this season thus far, the Atlanta Falcons have struggled mightily against opposing quarterbacks. That's why it's surprising to see that Bo Nix is currently only being started in 25% of Yahoo leagues going into week 11. The Atlanta Falcons, since week 6, are the 5th best matchup at the quarterback position based on quarterback passing statistics isolated, allowing 17.4 within that category, a ridiculous number. But not only that, in 7 of the last 8 games that the Atlanta Falcons have played, they have allowed 2 or more touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks. The following stats are the fantasy point totals of quarterbacks against the Atlanta Falcons over the course of the last 2 months here. Derek Carr, 20.5. Dallas's quarterbacks combined for 23.3. Mayfield, 22.3. Geno, 17.8. Dalton, 14.9, and Mayfield again, 23.4. Consistent production from every single quarterback over this course of time, and that doesn't even account for the overall rushing ability that, of course, Bo Nix has. Over the course of this season, the Falcons have also struggled in terms of stopping opposing rushing quarterbacks. Earlier this season, Justin Fields ran for 57 rushing yards. Jalen Hurts, 85 and a touchdown. Baker Mayfield even scrambled for 42 yards. And even Dak Prescott, which isn't really a scrambling quarterback, ran for 30 yards against them on 3 attempts. So you would assume a player like Bo Nix, who thus far this season from weeks 1 through 10 is averaging 6 attempts per game for 29 rushing yards per game and 0.4 rushing touchdowns per game on average, you would assume that we're going to be in a situation in which Bo Nix not only going to be able to take advantage of the 2 touchdowns, but also get himself rushing upside, which in this upcoming matchup that could potentially become a shootout, is exciting for him to find himself upside and even be a top 10 quarterback. There's a reason why I have him ranked as highly as I do based on my quarterback rankings as of thus far this week, is because I truly trust the matchup and his overall production as of late, coming off of a week in which he had over a 70% passing completion percentage against the Kansas City Chiefs and really pushed that team and their defense, which has played incredibly well thus far this season, to the absolute limit of the final play of the game. All right, let's close out today's episode in regards to our hidden gems with John Parker Romo, kicker of the Minnesota Vikings. I can't believe that he is currently still only rostered in 7% of leagues on Yahoo. That is a disservice, not only to your fantasy teams, but to him. As of thus far this season, the Minnesota Vikings kickers have been incredible. When we look at what Will Reichard was able to accomplish prior to going onto the injured reserve, 6 of his last 7 games in which he played, he had himself a minimum of 2 field goal attempts per game. Not only that, was averaging 3 PATs per game on average over the course of that span of time. Now, what we saw from John Parker Romo last week, 4 for 4 on field goals, and especially considering the struggles that we have seen from Sam Darnold over the course of the last 2 games, throwing many of turnovers, they've continued to have to settle for field goals within the red zone. So going into this week, taking on the Tennessee Titans, you would assume that, of course, we're going to have many of opportunities to score, and if in fact this offense is going to stall out in any sort of circumstance, of course, they're going to call upon John Parker Romo to come out and kick some field goals. Last week had 13 fantasy points over the course of the season thus far. After week 1, Will Reichard was averaging over 10 fantasy points per game on average over the course of this entire season. For those of you dealing with kicker struggles, of course, with Austin Seibert, obviously out with an injury, Harrison Butker now going to the injured reserve. There are many injuries to the kicker position, which again is relatively rare, but look towards picking up John Parker Romo. Another kicker that I could potentially mention is a guy like Brandon Aubrey. Again, now associated with a lesser offense, I don't want to have him as my kicker. I didn't have him ranked last week on Sunday because of that, and we're going to continue with the idea of potentially picking up someone else in their absence in order to give ourselves the potential of scoring 10 plus fantasy points, if not more, within the upcoming week, which is why I close out this week's hidden gems with the milestone being John Parker Romo. All right, before we close out today's episode, we're going to go ahead and let's talk about a couple of entries via Underdog right now in regards to week 11 picks. Now, going into this week, again, this is the first entry that I've gone ahead and put in. When I've gone ahead and kind of scoured the entire number base via Underdog, these were the numbers that popped out to me. Again, I always want to follow receptions, especially at the running back position when I know that they're going to be automatics. As of this season thus far, Bijan Robinson, 9 of the last 10 games has been able to surpass that number. Kenneth Walker, 5 of the last 6 games able to surpass that number. Kamara, 7 of the last 7. ETIENNE, 5 of the last 5 with Tua Tagovailoa. I would assume this is an automatic to succeed within the upcoming performance. Then we move on to this next one, where we have Justin Jefferson going higher than 4.5 receptions. He has done that in 7 of the last 7 games. Brock Bowers, 5 of the last 5. ETIENNE, 5 of the last 5. And of course, Khalil Shakir, 4 of the last 4, but also 6 of the last 7 healthy games in which he has played thus far this season. These are another one of these automatics in which we're just going higher on receptions across the board on players that we truly do like. Now we close out today's episode in regards to these following plays: Nico Collins, Justin Jefferson, George Pickens. Again, this is literally my number 2, 3, and 4 ranked wide receiver going into the week. So you would assume that 60 or 70 receiving yards is definitely within the realm of possibility. Justin Jefferson surpassing this number in 7 of the last 8 games. Nico Collins, 9 of the last 9. And George Pickens with Russell Wilson, 3 of the last 3. And now has an opportunity of taking on the easiest matchup at the wide receiver position, taking on the Baltimore Ravens of all defenses. Again, this is an automatic in my mind. Again, another $100 entry. Again, I'll continue to put together more slips later tonight in regards to the live stream that I will be conducting at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Again, if you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. I'll also be live streaming tomorrow afternoon at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and Sunday morning starting at 7 a.m. PST. If you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. But also, if you want to potentially follow these entries, be sure to travel down below in the description. Check out Underdog. Use code ANGEL today. Make that first-time deposit, and be sure to do so. I'll be back later tonight for a live stream. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.